so great to have you on the show today. Thank you for taking the time. I'm really excited for our conversation. You know, we've only known each other for a couple of years now, but every time that we've gotten the opportunity to hang out and connect, I've always experienced you with this joyful, grounded presence, and the conversations we've had have been so amazing. And I'm very much looking forward to exploring your experience of your life and the nuggets of wisdom you've acquired on your journey and how that might be able to support our listeners today.
Well, likewise, Austin, I have really enjoyed our connection. I'm proud of you for what you're doing with the Rational Mystic podcast and really excited to talk with you today.
Awesome. Well, thank you for being here. Yeah, so there's a couple of exciting things that I've loaded into my memory for this conversation. The first is recently read your book, Resilience, which was incredible. Very much was a series of written as a series of letters. And I loved how you incorporated so much beautiful ancient and modern wisdom and really unpacked your own lived experiences, especially being a former Navy SEAL, and how you have mined all those experiences for gold and shared it with the world. It's really, really powerful. So thank you for doing that.
Oh, you're very welcome. You're very welcome. I'm really proud of Resilience, and I'm really glad to hear that it resonated with you.
Yeah. So for those who haven't read your book, tell us a little bit more about what resilience is about and what your definition of resilience is.
Yeah, well, look, I think everybody who's listening to your podcast right now has experienced pain. Everybody has experienced suffering. Everybody deals with tragedy. We know that these things happen in every life. And we also know from our own lives that a lot of times the pain that you suffer can lead to wisdom. We know that suffering can lead to strength. We know that tragedy can lead to joy, but it doesn't always happen that way. And resilience is really the process by which people deal with pain and create wisdom. It's the process by which they deal with suffering and create strength. It's the process by which we all have to deal with tragedy and create joy. And what I was trying to do in the book was I wrote it as a series of letters to my buddy. His name is Drew Sheets. And in the book, we changed it to Walker, but he's since come out publicly and actually said this book and this process changed his life. And he's happy to have his name out there publicly. So Drew was a Navy SEAL with me. He went through BUDS training, which is the basic underwater demolition SEAL training. We can talk about it later, but it's the kind of world famous training where in our class with me and Sheets, we started with over 220 people in our original class and we graduated with 21. So incredibly difficult, really hard training. I pulled on some of the lessons from SEAL team training. On some of the lessons that I learned working with kids and families in international humanitarian disasters around the world. And then, as you indicated, Austin, also pulled on a lot of the wisdom that's out there about how we can deal with pain that is oftentimes for many people inaccessible today. And I think one of the things that I is so important about podcasts like this is that you're giving people an opportunity to connect to the wisdom that's there. And if it's okay, I might push this idea a little bit. You know, if you think of, I often use an analogy, which is to the stars, right? And if you think about our ancestors, they knew the stars. They looked at them every night. They had stories that they told their children about the stars. They could actually track the movement of different stars across the sky. They knew how the stars interacted with the seasons. Today, the stars are still there. Most people don't even see them. And very few people know the names of even more than a couple of constellations. The same thing with trees. It used to be that our ancestors knew the names of every tree. They could tell if they were flourishing. They could tell if they were sick. And today, a lot of people can walk through a forest and they don't know the name of 5 different trees. The same is true of wisdom. It used to be that we lived in a world where there was a lot of wisdom around. Stories that were passed down from ancestors, sacred texts, things that people could connect to. that wisdom is still there, but unfortunately for a lot of people, just like light pollution has made it difficult to see the stars, and just like our modern way of life has made it difficult for people to understand the trees and nature and flowers, it's also true that our modern way of living has cut people off from a lot of the wisdom that their ancestors would have had access to. And so, one of the things that I'm trying to do in resilience is to bring a lot of that wisdom forward. For me, a lot of it is in the Stoic tradition, but there's a lot of wisdom that's out there about how we can make it through the pain, the suffering, the difficulty in our life, and actually mine it for wisdom and joy and strength.
That's beautiful. Yeah, and it makes me think of the story that you shared. Maybe you can share it again for the audience today. The one where after the most intense part of Bud's training, that you finally got your first opportunity to sleep for like 3 hours and you couldn't sleep.
Yeah.
And that it was one of the most painful experiences you've ever had. And can you share that story again? And it really
Well,
stuck out to me as such a poignant insight into the stories that we tell about our pain and how that affects whether it becomes a trauma or whether it becomes, you know, a powerful insight that could be life changing.
yeah, 100%. So this was a moment that took place during Hell Week. So Hell Week is considered to be the hardest week of Bud's training. Bud's training is considered to be the hardest military training in the world. So this is the hardest week of the hardest military training in the world. And this was my hardest moment in that hardest week of the hardest military training in the world. And what had happened was we had made it through the first night, and we made it through the next couple of days. And I can't remember exactly, but we're 72 hours in, and we have not slept. And to give everybody a sense for what's happening during that training, you read a little bit about it in the book. You're doing 4-mile timed runs in soft sand. You're doing 2-mile ocean swims. You're running the obstacle course. Every single time you eat, you're running miles to the chow hall and back. It is a week of constant military training. You're running in and out of the freezing Pacific Ocean, and your body and soul are tested in a way that no one has ever been tested before. No one who's in the training has ever been tested in the way that they're tested in Buds. Now, I was an officer, so I was a Navy officer, which means that I was a leader in my Buds class, and it also meant that I was a leader. I had a boat crew that I was with. And a lot of people, when they look at the outside at Buds, they think it's harder if you're a leader. And in some ways it is, because they make sure the officers, you have to not only finish the 4-mile timed runs, but you need to be towards the front of the pack. You need to not only finish the 2-mile ocean swims, you need to be towards the front of the pack. They're expecting you to be able to lead in every case. But for me, I actually found that leading made things easier, because when I was in the training, every single moment, I had to be concerned about other people. When we were running down the sand, and you carry these inflatable boat smalls on your head. So if your listeners can picture this, you've got 7 guys running down the beach, and they all are balancing part of the boat on their head. We're all running together. It is painful. It is difficult. It is, and you're while you're doing this, you're aching, you're tired, you're freezing, you're covered in sand. But as a leader, at every moment, you're also thinking about your crew. You're watching, is this guy tired? Does this guy need a word of encouragement? Is it helpful to make a joke right now so that we can kind of keep going? So you're always thinking about how you get your team through those moments of incredible hardship. And my hardest moment came when they sent us to sleep for the first time. So there was some kind of contest we had to do. I think it was like a dip contest to see who was going to be able to actually go in and sleep for the first time in the tent, because you have to compete for everything in Buds.
Right.
My boat
And
crew lost.
wait, and this was after, I believe you said 72 hours of no sleep.
Yes. Yeah. This is 72 hours of no sleep. And then there's a competition to see which team is going to get to run into the tent first to actually go to bed. So Hell Week is a week of constant military training. The average class sleeps for about 2.5 to 3 hours over the course of that week. And in our class, we had not slept up until that moment. And so they're having this contest to see which team is going to be able to go in to sleep first. My team lost. So we went into the tents last. And as an officer, you always do everything last. You eat last. You always put your team first. So I was the last guy into the tent. And when I got in, I took this cot and I laid down. And as I'm laying there, there's an open hole in the tent and there's a beam of sunlight that is coming in. And while I've been freezing the whole week, now it's incredibly hot right on my tent. And I start this mind cycle like, this is so unfair. How come I've got the worst cot? This isn't right. I only get to sleep for 3 hours this whole time, and everybody else is passed out. Everyone in the class is completely passed out. And I'm awake. And so I went outside. I got up, I walked outside the tent, and there were a couple of young guys who were also in the Navy who they kind of post as guards outside. And I walked outside and they're like, "Are you okay, sir?" Like, because nobody's awake at that point. Like, everybody's asleep. I walked outside, they're like, "Are you okay?" So I'm like, "I'm fine, I'm fine." And I just walked over to these walls where we had a little faucet. I turned one on, splashed some water over my head, and I just took a moment and I looked out at the ocean. It was beautiful. And I let myself switch my mindset from this is unfair, I'm being persecuted, to wow, I've been given this incredible gift. I have this moment to pause in the middle of this journey that I've been focused on for years and have been living through, to actually have a real moment of peace here. And I realized later that the reason why that moment was so hard for me was because it was the only moment in all of Hell Week where I was just focused on my own pain.
Hmm.
Because I was focused on myself and this isn't fair and this isn't right and I've got the worst cod and how come, you know, and what's going to happen if I can't sleep? You only get 3 hours of sleep. So it's all of this projection of fears into the future combined with this thought that this isn't fair. And it was my hardest moment by far. Once I kind of paused, saw where I was, saw the gift in that moment, and then also went back to my thought and my purpose, which is that I'm going to make it through this training and I'm also going to lead my team through. I went back in, I laid it back down, I fell asleep, and we woke up and we finished Hell Week.
Wow. What a story, man.
Yeah.
You also said in the book that one of your realizations in that moment was like, I have just crossed the finish line of the hardest thing that I've ever done in my entire life.
Yes. Yes. And I knew for me when I went back into the tent, that, yeah, there was still, whatever it was, a day or two left of Hell Week. I was like, I got this. That was my finish line
Yeah.
when I crossed through that moment. And, it may be helpful, Austin. I'll tell you one other story about what was the hardest moment for the class in Hell Week, because I think that your listeners may find it valuable. So the hardest moment for the class actually came at the beginning of the second night. So what happens is, everybody was woken up the first afternoon or the first early evening, and we're run through the training all that first night. And then you go through the training the next day and everybody is jacked on adrenaline. Like, it is Hell Week and it has started. And there's, however many guys are left at that point, 180-ish, right? And we're just everybody is pumped about being in Hell Week. And they've got artillery simulators going off and smoke grenades, and they're spraying you with water hoses while you're doing push-ups and sit-ups. Like, it's just madness and chaos and a tremendously good time. And a tremendously good time, right? So you're going through this with your boat crew. And you go through the whole first night of training and you arrive at the beginning of the second night. And now you've been training at this point for about 27-ish hours. And what they did was they took the class out and they lined us up on the sand berm to watch as the sun was setting. Now, keep in mind, at this point, after 20, at least it's at least 24, maybe it's 27 hours of constant training, everybody is wrecked. I mean, you think about how hard, how depleted your body feels after a marathon, or how depleted which is 3-ish hours, right? Or how depleted your body feels after an incredibly hard workout. You've now been training for 24 hours, and Hell Week hasn't even started. You're one day in. So what they did was they lined the class up on the berm to watch as the sun was setting. And as the sun was going down, they got on their bullhorns. Now, you might remember, Austin, and your listeners might remember, that if you ever want to quit in SEAL team training, all you have to do is ring this bell. And it's a bell they carry around with the class. If you ring the bell 3 times, it means that you've quit. As the sun is going down, the instructors come out and they get on their bullhorns and they say goodnight to the sun. It's going to be a very, very long night. And we're watching the sun go down. And as the guys are watching the sun go down, the instructors are saying, Hell Week hasn't even begun. And what happened then was somebody ran off of the berm and they ran over to the bell and they rang it and they quit. And then somebody else ran off the berm and they ran over to the bell and they rang it and they quit. And then you could hear the bell going off, ding, 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 ding. We had more people quit our class at that moment than quit at any other time in all of the SEAL team training.
Wow.
Now, you think about all the things they ask you to do in the training. They tie your feet together and they tie your hands behind your back. They throw you in the pool. They make you do these 4-mile timed runs in soft sand. They attack you underwater when you're doing these pool comp things. They do the 2-mile ocean swims. Who would have thought that the hardest moment of the hardest week of the hardest military training in the world would come when all they actually asked us to do was to stand on the beach and watch the sunset. That's all we had to do in that moment. All we had to do was actually stand on the beach and watch the sunset.
It's also like the opposite of the 4-minute mile, right? The moment that you start seeing everyone drop like flies, it makes you question your resolve.
100%. And what happened, Austin, was you always found this. Not I won't say always. People quitting groups. They'd be in tremendous pain. They'd be holding, we're in the ocean. We kind of have our arms locked together. The waves are crashing over us. It's absolutely freezing. You're 48 hours in. Your legs are chafed. Your ankles are chafed. Every time the salt water hits you, you feel like you're burning. It's terrible. And somebody would see someone else quit, and then they'd think, okay, it's okay to quit now. And then they'd go and quit. And it is just like we can set positive examples for people. It's also the case that if you're surrounded by people who are giving up, if you're surrounded by people who are quitting, it makes it easier to quit.
Yeah. What an incredible experience, and so many life lessons packed into that experience. Actually, both of the experiences that you said. I mean, what I'm also noticing is just the lessons in leadership
Yeah.
that must have come through that experience, right? As you were, in the first example, in the first story, as you were realizing in that moment that the moment you were focusing on you and your story, that was the moment where it was the most challenging, most painful.
Right.
But that focusing outward onto the responsibility and the accountability that you have for the people that you're there to support in becoming the best version of themselves, like that is such a powerful, powerful insight. And also, like, even within that, when you are focusing in on yourself, being able to really understand and recognize the narrative and the story and the mindset that you are running on repeat, whether you're being present or whether you are thinking about the future or what's going to come next, and letting that override your ability to be present in the moment. It's really powerful.
100%, Austin. And I think, for everybody who's listening, one of the beautiful things about this is that very few people will go to SEAL team training, but we all have the opportunity to ask ourselves what's really happening in this moment. And if you think about a lot of the wisdom in kind of like an Eckhart Tolle, like The Power of Now,
Mhm, mhm.
Ram Dass, Be Here Now, right? They're all focused on like how do you actually stay present in the present moment? It's the same thing from Seneca in the Stoic tradition, right? It's the ability to control the mind from running into the future to create some fear-based story for yourself, which allows you to actually, if you can control that, it actually allows you to stay present and just do what you need to do in this moment.
Yep. And also, it is a reflection of the state of your nervous system in that moment, too.
Yes.
When you're in a state of fight or flight, your mind is more, and you're rushed, you're flooded with noradrenaline, epinephrine, and
Yes.
adrenaline, and all of it, right? Cortisol, and you're in this hyper stress state, and your heart's rapidly beating. Your brain pattern matches that state to stories from the past, and also that triggering a fear of what could happen in the future, and then comes the stories.
Yes. And I think you're so wise to point that out, that it is so often in our culture, when people are in a difficult spot, they immediately think of the mind and they think of trying to control the mind. And in fact, a lot of times your mind is just trying to create thoughts. Your mind creates thoughts in the way that your heart creates beats, and it does this to protect you. And oftentimes, one of the things that you can do is to actually try to grab control of your body. And we have there's only two systems in our body, which are both voluntary and involuntary, and it's blinking and breathing. And so if you can just train yourself in those moments to take one really deep breath, it's the lever that you can pull on all of those other involuntary systems in your body. It's such a simple tool, but it speaks to your wider insight about being able to gain control over your nervous system, gain control over your body. Because when you start to regulate your body, it is easier to regulate your mind. And then your mind becomes more regulated, it becomes easier to regulate your body. And the path in for people, the very simple way in on that is like, okay, well, that sounds like a lot to do. Regulate my body, regulate my mind. There's actually a really simple path in, and that is just to learn to take one really good, deep breath.
Yeah. Most people are living in a constant state of low grade hypoxia.
Yeah.
People breathe so shallowly,
Yeah.
because when we're in our automatic response, in our repetitive loop of our patterns of not paying attention to what's actually going on in our body, we
Right.
forget to breathe.
Yes.
And I think that this is actually the definition of pretension.
Mhm.
A lot of people think pretension is just being arrogant,
Mm,
but I think
mm,
that
mm.
pretension is also tensing yourself before something is going to happen, whether
Yeah.
that is a tension in the body or a tension in the mind or a tension of the ego, right?
Yes. Yes.
And not everyone, but a lot of people walk around with pretense,
Yes.
right? With tension in their body, with shallow breathing. And
Yes.
it's so profound how a simple deep breath can help you connect with your body. And another breathing technique that I like to use often is the 8 count breath,
Yes.
which is super simple. You just breathe for 8 seconds in and then exhale for 4 seconds out. And if you do that, that pulls the e brake on your sympathetic nervous system and gets you into a parasympathetic state.
100%.
And it's a really powerful shift, because one of my mentors told me once that the mind is an information processing system that runs through the body.
Mm. Hmm.
in that our mind is literally an emergent set of information and experiences that's generated by our body.
Right.
So the state of our physiology, the state of our nervous system in the moment is either contributing to a, survival, negative, fear-based projection of the future, or it's a level of stillness and presence and ease and equanimity and equilibrium that from that place, the stories that we create are coming from an aligned place of ease.
Yeah. Yeah. Two quick reflections on that. I think what you're saying is exactly right. One is so I've got two little boys, Joshua and Jacob. And one of the like little cues that I give them is that I just say no's. When they're all fired up, or especially like they've hurt themselves or whatever, and I just say no's, and then they know like, and it's amazing to see the difference that it brings about in them. And this is something that obviously you can teach kids at any level, at any age, right? And you just start to build that very simple habit of doing so. And I think that you're really wise to connect it to the notion of story. It's one of the things that I talk about in resilience is that human beings are narrative creatures.
Mhm.
We tell each other stories, we remember stories. If you and I, talked about 10 different facts about breathing and adrenaline and whatever, like it's possible that people who are listening might not remember any of them. It is possible though that if we tell each other a good story, that somebody might remember that story. We're just built to remember stories and to tell stories. And of course, the most important story that we tell is the story we tell ourselves about ourselves. And it is amazing sometimes how many people who are outwardly kind and compassionate and thoughtful and considerate can actually turn on themselves. And I've done this myself, turn on themselves and be incredibly rigid and difficult and harsh with themselves. And uh, all of that is to say that becoming aware of the story we're telling ourselves about ourselves is incredibly powerful.
100%. And that goes deep down the rabbit hole of your own personal identity, your
Yes.
own belief system,
Yes.
what you believe to be true about yourself,
Yes.
what's in your shadow,
Yes.
what's in your blind spot of the unprocessed, unknown aspects of self that are self-sabotaging,
Yes.
And I think that it's speaking of speaking of ancient wisdom and philosophers, right? Who was it that said, I think it was Aristotle who said, the unexamined life is not worth living.
Yes. Yes. It was Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle all said something like that. Yes,
Yeah.
that's exactly right. And in fact, over the temple of Apollo, the big inscription was "Know thyself."
Hmm.
That this was the path to wisdom, ease, joy, and flourishing.
Hmm. Hmm. And there's so much that we can learn about ourselves through self-reflection and through radical self-introspection. But I have found that illuminating things in my blind spot is almost always done in connection and conversation with people who can be mirrors for me and show me things about myself that I can't see.
Yes, well, of course, look, like the butterfly can't see its own wings. And if you've ever known a brilliant surgeon, right? You can know the most brilliant surgeons in the world. You can know 100 of them. None of them operate on themselves, right? There's certain things and this is why Aristotle talked about friendship. In the Nicomachean Ethics, the friendship is the subject that he talks more about than anything else. And the book, his Nicomachean Ethics, was designed as kind of his very practical book about how to live a flourishing life. And he talks about friendship. And this is what friends can do for you. Friends can see you of course, in ways that you cannot see yourself. And this is true by definition, which is why so many of those insights can and must come from actual friends.
Hmm.
And
And it requires that we be vulnerable and that we invite feedback,
yes, yes,
right? Because,
yes.
and another quote that has been popping up that another friend of mine said recently, and it just keeps coming into my awareness, is unspoken expectations are premeditated resentments.
Mm-hmm. Yes, yes.
The more that we have expectations of
That's
other
brilliant.
people that
Yes.
we don't communicate,
Right?
people can't read our minds,
Where
And
and
then when we don't communicate those things, it can build and build into this, you know, this nexus of resentment that then can explode. And when instead we invite other people to give us constructive feedback about the way that they're experiencing us, instead of being defensive about it or being triggered about it, but actually having conscious conversation using conscious language and emotionally intelligent communication, that's how we create that dynamic of openness and receiving what other people have to offer us, and we take what's useful and we discard what doesn't work. But like
yes.
that, I think, is such an important aspect of knowing yourself, is and evolving as a human in community and in meaningful connections and relationships, is engendering that openness and that feedback.
Yeah, 100%. And I think that when we do that, when we've got that kind of channel, when you have the friends that are around you that are doing that, it leads to it's a virtuous circle, right? Where that kind of feedback taken on with the right mindset and the right intention actually leads you to get better. The process of getting better from the feedback makes you desire more of the feedback. You get more of the feedback, they find that they're more successful in giving it to you. They enjoy helping you because they see that giving you positive feedback actually leads you to become better. And you can get on a very, very virtuous circle. Or you can get in a vicious cycle where, as you said, there's unspoken expectations, which then become resentment, and that also leads to dishonesty because people aren't actually speaking what they want out of a relationship or any kind of partnership, and it can actually lead to you're actually a vicious cycle where that becomes resentment, and then the resentment makes people not want to take more feedback, etc.
I've seen this dynamic play out in some of my friendships where people are like in relationships and they are afraid of rejection, and they're afraid of not being enough, and they're afraid that if they show their true selves and be the most vibrant, effulgent version
Yes.
of themselves, that they're going to get shut down.
Right.
And so instead, they make themselves vanilla and they morph and mold themselves into what they perceive the other person's expectations are of them, which then they create this like inauthentic, not fully alive version of who they are. And it's like when you live in that way, you just become vanilla. And yes, you get love from everybody, but it's not real because they don't actually know who you really are. They've connected with the facade that you've put out to the world in order to, not be vulnerable with the parts of yourself that maybe you don't want people to see.
Yeah, and this is where courage comes in. And this is why courage is such an important virtue and why it's so important to understand it broadly. A lot of times when people think about courage, they think about courage in the boxing ring, or they think about the courage of a Navy SEAL, or they think about, maybe even, moral courage in a very difficult situation where you stand up. But actually, my belief is that there's really only two core emotions in life, and that's love and fear. And courage is love and action in the face of fear. And in fact, courage, the root of courage comes from the French coeur, meaning heart, right? So the whole idea is that your courage is the expression of your heart. It's the expression of your love. And when we don't have courage in these small things, they feel small, right? Being willing to be ourselves, being willing to be honest, being willing to be truthful. And instead, we act out of fear. All of that fear eventually eventuates in relationships that can fall apart, businesses that can fall apart, teams that can fall apart. So it's one of the reasons why I've always found the people who I have the longest and deepest and most meaningful connections with, if I had to say, like, what's the one virtue that's common among them, I might pick two, but one is courage and the other is a sense of humor, right?
Yeah.
If you've got courage and a sense of humor, like you could pretty much navigate almost anything. Yeah.
That is true. That is so true. If you're courageous and you're funny, the world is your oyster.
Right? Right?
You don't
Yeah.
even need to be smart. Like you still
No.
crush it.
Yes. It's really true. It was actually, to bring it back to the SEAL team training, one of the things people would ask me was, they're like, could you know who was going to make it? And we started with the 20
Mm.
guys. And in the beginning, when I got there, I thought that I would be able to tell. I was like, oh, this guy, I mean, look, he's like there are just some amazing athletes there, right? Just, state champion wrestlers, former college football players, international quality water polo players, etc. And you'd see some of these guys and like, oh, that guy's going to dominate this. He's going to make it through. And then you'd also be running into these dudes who like would be puking on the runs and they're having trouble on the pull-ups and like, this guy's not going to make it. But I was completely wrong. And you could not tell who was going to make it until the test came. Because the test was so deep, it wasn't testing your ability to run. It wasn't testing your ability to do pull-ups. It was testing your soul.
Your resolve.
It was testing your resolve. And you could not see that until the test actually came. And this is not universally true, but it was close to universally true that almost everybody who made it through had a good sense of humor. Because it was
Interesting.
so awful. It was so awful that you had to be able to laugh when it was really bad. I can
Right.
actually remember, we were just a couple hours into Hell Week and like we were cracking up. Like we were just having so much fun.
You got to have a little bit of absurdism in your
Yes.
philosophical cookbook for life
Right?
because if you don't, I mean, and you take yourself too seriously, then life is a lot more, there's a lot more innate suffering, right?
Yes.
I think there was a quote once that I heard, which was that pain is an inevitable part of the human experience, but suffering is optional.
Yes.
That
Yes.
suffering is the resistance of pain through the mental anguish and the story that we tell ourselves about our pain.
Yes. Yes.
And so that goes back to what we were talking about in terms of narrative. It's like
Yes.
your interpretation and your perception is everything as it relates to your level of joy and happiness in the face of adversity.
Yeah. And I might even pull on one thread here. There's something you mentioned before, and I want to kind of tie this practice we're at right now to something you mentioned before, which was the self-sabotage.
Mhm.
Because we've talked now about how, gaining control of your body, gaining control of your mind, right, is a way forward. We've talked about courage and having a sense of humor is a way forward. We've talked about some very practical techniques about taking a breath and how that's kind of a way forward. And we've talked about, you were just mentioning how, it's not just pain, it's the anguish that you bring to it, right? All of these things point to, again, part of the every wisdom tradition, which is that it's the mastery of you that leads to the mastery of life and your ability to give your gifts to the world. And people have this sense, like what is the hardest thing to deal with is self-sabotage, right? And one of the things I was writing to Drew Sheets was, sometimes, when people have trouble getting out of bed, they have trouble working, they have trouble doing these things. Like if somebody came into your house and forced you to stay in bed and like wouldn't let you work and did this, like you'd feel incredibly oppressed, right? But who's actually doing that to you? You're doing it to yourself, right? And
Yeah.
we've all been there. So what's the path out of that, right? Everybody deals with self-sabotage, and I don't know that this is the path out, but it's a path that I've found really helpful, which is that you have to you have the opportunity to say to yourself, what I'm doing is working in some way. It's solving some kind of problem. So you ask yourself, if we're going to use the Jungian notion of a shadow or whatever, like you ask yourself, what's the shadow doing for me?
Mhm.
What problem is it solving?
Mhm.
And then once you do that, you can also approach it in a different way. Look, I spent a lot of my life beating myself up for things that I wasn't doing in this way. And that's one answer, self-sabotage. No, I'm going to be strong. I'm going to beat the self-sabotage out of you. Or you can you can actually say to yourself, you know what I'm going to do is I'm going to ask myself, what is the shadow doing? What problem is it solving?
Mhm.
And then once you figure out what problem it's solving, you can say to yourself, you know what, Shadow, you don't need to solve that problem anymore. I, in my higher, better self, I've got a way to solve that problem.
Mhm.
And you can approach it in a new way. And in that way, I think you can kind of end the war within yourself. You
Mhm.
can thank the shadow for what it did for you. Like for a lot of people, you know, when I was working at the Mission Continues, where I obviously dealt with a lot of veterans who were dealing with addiction issues, right?
Mhm.
And they in particular like would beat themselves up about this. And then you can ask yourself, like, well, what was the addiction doing for you? Okay, it was giving you some comfort in a place where you had no comfort. It was allowing you to forget and detach from something that you thought was incredibly painful. It was allowing, and you ask yourself what was happening there, so that the approach moving forward can be no longer beating yourself up, but you ask yourself, what was the gift that the shadow was trying to give you? And instead of receiving it through whiskey, right? Instead of receiving it through self-sabotage, you find a way to give yourself that gift in another and healthier and more whole way.
Absolutely. And there's several things in what you said I want to double click on.
Please, yeah.
One of them is I think that the way I see it is really similar to how you just described it. I see it as every dysfunctional pattern that we have has within it a perceived benefit and a and a cost, right?
Yes.
So the perceived benefit of drinking, for example, to excess, right, is that I'm numbing my pain. My pain's going away, right? But then there's the actual cost of that is you're just suppressing it, you're just numbing it, and you're causing damage to your body, and you're like slowly chipping away at your self-trust bank account until you get to the point where you're bankrupt,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And so I think that's a really great way to look at it, to look at our escape routes, which are the things that we tend to do when we feel overwhelmed or when we
Mm.
hit a point of not feeling like we're able to process whatever we're experiencing, and recognizing that these dysfunctional patterns are trying to help us. There's a part of there's an unmet need that is partially being met, but not really. And then there's a massive cost associated with it.
Yes.
So when we can understand what the actual unmet need is underneath the dysfunctional pattern, we can create, which is, I'm just rephrasing in my own frame of reference what you
Exactly
said,
right. Yeah. Yeah.
which is when you understand what the unmet need beneath the dysfunction is, you can find a way to truly solve the root cause of that in a way that's healthy and aligned with your flourishing.
Yes. Yes. And yes.
And also, you know, what are those root causes? What are those unmet needs under the surface, right?
Mhm.
That's where going really deep is where all the value lies, right?
Yes.
Because a lot of the times it's actually self-abandonment of your own inner child.
Mm. Mm.
And I think that's the core underneath a lot of the dysfunction in society is ultimately that, right? There's a part of us, and as has been my personal experience too, like there's a part of me that isn't getting the care and the love and the nourishment and the being, cared for truly, that in when there's a lack of that, at least for me personally, I'll give you like a
Yeah,
direct example,
yeah,
right?
yeah.
My own addiction to caffeine and nicotine, which is a whole wavy, winding road of, quitting and getting back on it and like
Oh.
detoxing and retoxing and and I think a lot of it comes down to there's a perceived you're basically trading dopamine
Mm,
for connection,
mm,
right?
mm, mm,
Self-connection or connection with others. And
mhm,
that's what Dr. Gabor Mate,
mm,
who is an expert in addiction, says. He says that addiction is the opposite of connection,
mm,
whether that's connection with yourself or the connection with others.
mm,
For me, when I was growing up, I was raised by a single mom.
mm,
And the first time that my mom got in a new relationship when I was 10 years old and I was no longer the focus of the attention,
mm,
and I felt like, like all the love's gone,
mm.
and that's when I started like eating fast food and eating to excess and candy and like very soon after that caffeine because those things would give me that like feel good of the dopamine hit,
Yeah.
but really that was just a band-aid on the lack of being able to self-soothe and give myself love,
Mm-hmm.
you know?
Mm-hmm.
So I've become aware of that and healed the underlying pattern. There's still a level of like, I'm doing a lot of things in the world, and sometimes jacking up the energy levels and stealing energy from the future so I can get the thing done now is is
Yeah.
still a cost I'm willing to pay.
Yeah.
but
Yeah.
but I think ultimately uh, that is the inquiry to have about
Mm-hmm.
these dysfunctions. And when I say dysfunction, it's not like a self-judgment. It's just like I
Right.
don't I don't see patterns of behavior as good or bad. And I think that once we apply a label to it as being good or bad,
Yeah.
it actually takes us further away because we're applying a value judgment to a part of ourself, which can engender self-judgment and shame.
I think that's,
Versus,
is it working? Is it not working?
right,
Yeah. Yeah. I agree. Yeah.
it's either taking us certain ways of being yield certain results, and they're either taking you closer to your goals or further away from them.
Yes.
And that's it, right? And so that's where the self-evaluation comes in. It's like not beating yourself up of like, oh, I'm fucking up and I'm doing this thing and it's having, you know, giving yourself some grace, giving yourself a level of um, reassurance that uh, it's all okay. It's all working out for you. And there's an opportunity here to step into a new way of being that's going to take you where you want to go. And when
Yes.
you orient yourself to that like positive and optimistic mindset that anything is possible and that you have the agency and the sovereignty and the power to be the author of your own life, right? Then the
Yes.
whole thing starts to shift,
Yes.
right? The other thing I wanted to double click on is actually something you said in the book related to what you just said, which was um, the dynamic of, because I'm all about linguistics and language, and
Yes.
I'm a like I geek out on words, and and just like linguistic patterns in general. And you talked about in the book how the language of warfare being used in your own internal dialogue and the way that you communicate, right?
Right.
Of
Right.
crushing it and
Yes.
destroying it, and
Yes.
where there's like an enemy
Right.
involved in every
Right.
dynamic of a thing you have to overcome, which I'm sure is much more prominent with people who've actually seen war. I mean, that's
Right.
not me,
Right. Right.
but you have. So I would love for you to reiterate your thoughts on how the languaging around it being a battle is
Yeah.
actually is actually self-sabotaging in a way.
Yeah, it can be very self-sabotaging. If you think of you're gonna go to war with yourself, and there may be parts of yourself that you decide like, I want to move past this. I don't want to engage in this anymore. I want to move past this relationship, I want to move past this behavior. And oftentimes when you go to war with yourself, um, it doesn't lead to the fundamental transformation that you're looking for because you haven't achieved the level of understanding that allows for the real transformation and integration. And it's related actually. So knowing that you love geeking out on words, let me throw two great like concepts into this mix because it relates to I think that they're fundamental to what we're talking about, and they're big. I don't want to say misconceptions, but there's certainly I'm going to offer people real alternative ways of thinking about things. So the first idea relates to this very notion of good and bad. Okay. So the Greeks had a word called arete, and arete was an excellence. So anything could have an excellence. So a runner who ran really fast and ran a lot of races, you'd say that was a fast runner. A soldier who was courageous, they'd say they were a courageous soldier. They had the arete, they had the excellence of being fast, of being courageous. Painter who painted beautiful paintings had the arete, the excellence of being a great painter. Now, they thought of it as an excellence. And why is this important? Because they recognize that even in the pursuit of excellence, there's imperfection. So the 400-meter runner who comes out of the blocks, trips, falls flat on their face, and loses the race isn't now a terrible runner. They had a bad race. The courageous man who is usually courageous and has a moment of cowardice and fails isn't a coward. He's a courageous man who had a failed moment. And it's the entire concept actually allows for a lot more grace when you're looking at yourself and you're looking at the world. If instead you're judging everything based on what's happening in that moment and you failed, okay, therefore you're a coward because you engaged in cowardice in this moment, it's much harsher and much harder, and it's also less accurate. If you're a failed runner because you tripped out of the blocks, it doesn't allow for, and in the Greek conception of excellence, what it also really allows for is the recognition that everybody's going to trip, everybody's going to fail, and that that's actually part of creating excellence. Right. We tend to use, in America, we often use a moral vocabulary which looks at one incident and then decides, oh, that person is X. They are X or they are Y or they are Z because this one thing happened one time, and it might have even been 10 years ago. It might have been when they were a different person.
Right.
And I actually have, this is a separate story, but a woman whose sentence I commuted and pardoned is coming to Austin. I think you're going to have her on your podcast, perhaps, Judy Henderson, right? And I was recently speaking to a group of prisoners, right? And the idea that somehow Judy is supposed to be judged for what happened, 36 or 40 years ago, instead of being the woman who she is today, doesn't make any sense. And the invitation here for everyone is to have that more graceful approach to thinking about excellence within yourself.
I love that. And another frame of reference on that same concept is in child psychology, right?
Yes.
Instead of when you're parenting a child,
Right.
instead of telling them, and we're all reparenting ourselves all the time. So reading about child psychology is reading about your psychology. It's not,
Yes.
specific to kids, right? And when you see a behavior that is unacceptable, right? You don't say you're bad, right? You say that thing that you did in that moment was not acceptable.
Yeah.
Right? You're creating a psychological distance at the level of identity because the words we use, especially when we say the words I am, followed by words, is encoding in your subconscious mind into your belief system about who you are.
It's so important.
So when it's the same for yourself in your own internal monologue, in your own dialogue with yourself. It's like, instead of making these sweeping judgments of I am statements in a moment of, discontent with your performance in a thing or whatever, stating like, well, that last podcast I did wasn't up to my standard. Not I'm a piece of shit, right?
Right,
Like there's
right.
a very
Yes,
different way of communicating to yourself about yourself that creates psychological distance at the level of identity so that you can give yourself more grace and space and but also not sugarcoat it, also not bypass where there's opportunities for you to improve based on what your desired outcomes are.
exactly. Yeah, that's exactly right. And I find that all the time with my boys, right? Is that, I'm talking to them and it's really important. One of the things that I always emphasize to them is like I always say, guys, guess what? Do you remember daddy used to be a little boy? Like, did I make mistakes? Did I do other things? Like, of course. Did I want to play games? Did I want to do this? Like, of course. Like, I had all of the same desires that you did. And my job as your papa is just to show you the things that are going to work better for you. And I think it's really important that we do that, because it leads to, and this was the second concept that I was going to share, is that this concept of eudaimonia.
Mhm.
So, the Greeks had a concept for what it meant to live a good life. And it was a
Mhm.
eudaimonia, a eudaimonic life meant that it was a flourishing life. That
Mhm.
was the idea of a good life. And we don't really have an equivalent concept in English, right? If you ask people like, what do you want out of life? People are like, oh, I want to be happy, right? And happiness, we could dive down the rabbit hole of like analyzing happiness and why the pursuit of happiness doesn't actually work. Like happiness comes when you are pursuing other things, etc. But the point is that they had this idea that you wanted to live a flourishing life. You wanted to live a eudaimonic life. And what did that mean? Like a flourishing life meant that you had to have certain things, just like a tree to flourish needs to have soil and needs to have sunlight and it needs to have water. You need to have friends and you need to have a purpose and you need to have good nutrition. These are the things that make for a flourishing life. And I think it's another concept from kind of that ancient wisdom that I think is very liberating for people when they're thinking about what does it mean to live a good life. Because if you get trapped in the idea that you're supposed to be happy all the time, you often find people are beating themselves up because they're not happy all the time. But you weren't meant to be in a constant state of exalted, happy emotion. Yes.
It's the same thing with success or
Yeah.
fame, right?
Yes.
Those things are not goals, they're byproducts.
Right.
They're
Right.
byproducts of creating from a place of purpose.
Yes. Yes. Exactly.
I
100%.
think that we all have our own evolutionary niche in the universe, the thing that only we can do, and that, when I want to create and live in a world where the majority of people are in the pursuit of what their unique passion and purpose is in
Yes.
life,
Yes.
because that solves everything else, right?
Yes.
It literally solves everything else. Like if we're all playing our role in the fabric of life, the gifts that we were born with, and transmuting the painful experiences into powerful realization and insight, and then sharing those with other people. That is the byproduct of that. Yes, it's happiness and success and maybe fame and all of those things, but ultimately the byproduct of that is an end to conflict.
Hmm.
And because I feel like all conflict ultimately arises from man's dissatisfaction with himself. And that dissatisfaction comes from a lack of aligned purpose. And yeah, so this is a really great segue because
Yes.
I'm
Please.
all about the exploration of life purpose is a
Yes.
big tenet of the rational
Yes.
mystic.
Yes.
And I think that you have a lot of really great insights on this. I know for a fact because I read the chapter in your book Resilience on vocation, which
Yes.
might as well have been called purpose.
Yes. Yes.
And it was a very beautiful and poignant analysis and exploration of what it looks like to create a life of purpose and meaning. And this also makes me think of Viktor Frankl and
Mm.
his book.
Yes.
That was Viktor Frankl was coming up for me a lot when I was reading your book, especially
Mm.
when you were going deep into the pain stuff
Yes.
and the challenges and the adversity. And Viktor Frankl had, he basically, when he was, in the situation he was in, he came up with a map for what purpose meant to him.
Mm,
And it's three things that we can derive purpose from. One is from our work,
yeah,
which is the things that we create that are significant.
yeah.
The other is from love, the
Mhm.
connections, the relationships, family. And the third is suffering.
Yeah.
And he said that when we turn our suffering into the triumph of the human spirit, when we mine it for insights and then share it with
Yes.
others so that maybe we can take a
Yes.
little bit of pain
Yeah.
and suffering out of other people's lives, because you get to share yours in a way that transmutes and accelerates someone right out of having to have the same experiences that you did, then that's meaningful, that's purposeful,
Yes.
right? And if you look at a lot of the top authors who share their stories, like Judy, right, of the crazy, ridiculous, unfair, situations that they went through, some of the it all becomes beautiful and meaningful when you share it in a way that inspires other people.
Yes.
And you don't need to be a genius or brilliant or have money or power or any of those things to be able to share how you've transmuted your own pain, and how that the insights from that can lighten someone else's load.
Yeah, 100%. It's such a great reminder, Austin. Thank you for that. About, yeah, the work, love, and suffering. That's what Viktor Frankl talks about as the sources of meaning. And it is. It's really, really beautiful. It's a really beautiful way to think about how we create purpose in our life. Yeah.
Yeah.
And yeah, there's so much there. But yeah.
No, please. I would love to hear more about what feels most alive for you to share from your own exploration of your purpose. And I
Yes.
think also, given that you strike me as someone who is very much a Renaissance man and is very interdisciplinary. You've had a really wide array of lived experiences that have all been so vastly different,
Yeah.
yet are fundamentally you. Being
Yes.
the former governor of Missouri, being a Navy SEAL, right? Being an author of multiple books, and an entrepreneur, and all of the things that you've created, and all the nonprofit work that you've done. It's like a pretty impressively wide array of dope things.
Thanks.
And so, yeah, I would love to learn more about how these very disparate and different lived experiences, and your just thoughts on purpose that you have acquired through those experiences.
Mm. Yeah, there are two things that I'm coming up right now. The first is it actually relates a little bit to one of the earlier lessons from SEAL team training, but I'll talk about how I used it later in life. And it was a lesson I learned very early on doing international humanitarian work. So when I was in college and then later in graduate school, I was studying how international humanitarian organizations work with kids in war zones. And when I was 20 years old, I went to live and work in Bosnian refugee camps. Now, you think about tough life situations, right? Everyone in a refugee camp, they have by definition lost their home. Many of them had lost relatives, they'd suffered violence, they're in a camp. They have no sense for when this situation is going to end. They have no sense for what the next chapter is going to be like. There's no school for the older kids or adults, extraordinarily few activities, not great food. Like, this is a really, really tough situation. And one of the things that I observed in the refugee camp was that the people who were doing the best were often the parents and the grandparents who had really young kids, because they had to wake up every day and do something for somebody else. And later, when I came back from Iraq after my team had been hit by a suicide truck bomb. I was very fortunate that my wounds were minor, but a lot of the guys who I was with were hurt far worse than I was. And when I went to the Bethesda Naval Hospital to visit with some recently returned wounded Marines, and we actually had some sailors and soldiers and airmen all in Bethesda. And you ask them, what do you want to do when you recover? all of them say to you, I want to return to my unit. Now, the harsh reality was for most of those guys that they were not going to be able to return to their unit. One guy had been shot through the neck, another had lost his hearing, another had lost an arm. So they weren't going to be able to return to their unit. And what I saw at the time was that a lot of the world was responding to them. When I say the world, I mean their world, right? Their community, their friends, their family, the country was responding to them with charity. Here's some free movie tickets. We're so sorry this happened to you. Here's a blanket. Here's a free fishing trip. Here's a free this. Here's a free that. If you think about what's happening psychologically, like, look, a couple months ago, this guy was, a sergeant of Marines with the flag of the United States on his arm. He was leading people in Afghanistan. He had a mission. He had a purpose. He had a team. He was courageous. He was doing things. And then all of a sudden he's come back injured and everybody's saying, oh, poor baby, what do you need? And
That's emasculating.
yeah, well, it's terribly, terribly, yes, emasculating, and it just rips someone's sense of purpose and value out of them. To have the whole world suddenly look at you, who used to be the courageous person who took on the hardest missions and did the most difficult things, now you are going to be someone who everyone else is going to give things to because you can't contribute. And what we
That
found,
I was just going to add really quick to that. I think that speaks to the victim mentality that
yes,
we see in
yes,
culture so much,
yes,
where, instead of taking full responsibility and owning the power of who you are, whenever you point to someone or something else as the reason for your quote unquote shitty situation,
right.
right? You give all your power away and suddenly you have the label as a victim. But what I'm hearing you say is how, from our culture, the way that we respond to, servicemen and women in a way that basically implies that they're a victim, which
Yes.
then creates this sort of pressure to succumb to this victim mentality, and how that is,
Yeah.
I guess emasculating is maybe not the best word, more like um, just taking away
Taking
your
away their
power.
power. I think it is. Yeah. And and then that led to the drinking, that led to the drugs, that led to the self-isolation. Like, because if I don't have anything to contribute, then what am I going to do? So what I did was I donated my combat pay and we started an organization called The Mission Continues. And the idea behind The Mission Continues is we're going to take all these incredible men and women who served in the United States military and are now learning how to overcome whatever challenges they're dealing with PTSD or TBI or loss of eyesight or loss of hearing. And we're going to put them to work at a Big Brothers Big Sisters, at a Boys and Girls Club, at a Habitat for Humanity, where they're going to continue to serve. And what happened was, as they continued to serve, they rebuilt their sense of purpose. And like, you know what, I want to go back to school. I want to do this. And they saw value in themselves. It was actually really heartening. I just got a note this morning from a former Mission Continues alumni who was a Marine who was saying, hey, I haven't talked to Eric for years and years, but I just want to let you know that you changed and saved my life. It was a really beautiful note I got just this morning. It actually made my morning. But the methodology of what the team did, what we did was very simple. It was saying everybody has a purpose and we're going to help you through this period to find yours. And the second thing that was coming up for me is that a lot of times, and I talk about this in the resilience book, the idea of a vocation or a purpose, sometimes people think like, I need to find my purpose.
Mhm.
And one of the points I made in the book is that, like, your purpose is not lost. It's not like your set of keys that's sitting around somewhere that you need to go and find. And the same thing with the idea of vocation, which often has a kind of theological implication. It's the vocare, it's a calling from God.
Mhm.
Is your vocation. What often happens is that actually people's calling that they hear, I use the phrase in the book, it's the echo of your own efforts.
Mhm.
To create your purpose, you do something. And then you're like, well, this didn't work. And then you do something else. And like, oh, that worked a little bit. And then you do something else. And then like, oh, this is really working. Right. And I would imagine I'd be curious for you to share with folks, like even your own journey in the podcast. right? Like, okay, how am wow, look, I'm really stepping into my purpose of taking my wisdom and taking my community and bringing people together and starting to share some of these lessons together. But it's not like that was sitting somewhere for you to be just discovered. It was something that you had to develop and you had to create. And so the encouragement to your listeners is that if you're feeling like you don't have your purpose right now, like that is okay. Everybody's been through periods like that, including me. And the answer is usually action. You take action and then you figure out, okay, like that kind of worked.
Yeah. The GPS appears when the car is in motion.
Yes. Right? Right. Yes. I
Yeah.
often say that like the bicycle is easier to balance when you're riding it. Right?
Same.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's
100%.
the same thing. Like a lot of people are trying to like balance the bike. I'm trying to balance my life. I'm like, you just got to go. And when you go, things will start to fall into balance.
For sure. Yeah. I mean, there's so many different definitions and perspectives on purpose,
Yes.
and there's nuggets of wisdom within each of them. And I try not to make a truth claim about 100% this is what it is,
Sure,
but I
sure.
can speak to some of the things that have inspired me about what purpose
Yes.
means to me.
Yes.
And it kind of starts with that Steve Jobs quote that you can't connect the dots looking forward, you can only connect them looking backward. I
100%.
think that when you look at these different wisdom traditions and methodologies that give you these little nuggets of insight about what purpose really is, right? The Bhagavad Gita, always have struggled pronouncing that, the concept of dharma
Mm,
and the concept of vocation that you just mentioned. Even though the more common definition or understanding of the word vocation is something more like career
mm.
versus calling from God,
Right.
right?
Right.
Um, I think that purpose is not a career, right? Purpose is not a thing that you do.
Right.
Purpose is a way of being. It's a frequency. And what does that even mean? It means that there is again, back to this idea of an evolutionary niche, right? What I mean when I say that is that everything we are is nature and nurture.
Beautiful.
And our creator, whatever that is for you, has imbued us with a unique set of preconceived like skills, talents, abilities, perspectives, right? So much of that comes from our lineage. I mean, I met my dad for the first time when I was 18, and I was shocked at how similar we were at the level of personality, despite
Wow.
having never had a conversation with him,
Wow. Wow.
down to food preferences being similar, right?
Wow. Yeah.
So there's an aspect of what the torch that we bear of
Yeah.
purpose and what we create that is passed on through our lineage. That is a familial story.
Yeah.
Then there's the aspect of how the unique combinatorials of our lived experience that gave us certain triumphs and pain and sorrow and overcoming adversity and all these things and the stories and the meaning we made and those moments where we were at a fork in the road and we had to either take the road less traveled or the one that everyone else takes, Robert Frost.
Yes.
And it is in taking the road less traveled, in following this innate impulse, this signal that's within us that guides us where we're meant to go, that we take the best next step
Yeah.
that takes us closer to what we're meant to create.
Yes.
And so when I say that, I think that, your purpose isn't your career is just something you do,
Right.
right? Your purpose is a way of being.
Yes.
For me, my current purpose is to create the next generation of emotionally intelligent and purpose-driven leaders.
Beautiful.
That's what I'm here to do.
Yes.
And it's a living thing. It's
Yes.
evolving.
Yes.
I'm doing new things.
Yes.
The universe aligns new experiences and people and possibilities that expand my mind, and then that thing will evolve and it will
Yes.
change.
Yes.
But I think the important thing is that my identity is not wrapped up in what I do.
Right. Right.
I don't derive a fundamental sense of my worth as a human being from what I do, because I think that that's a slippery slope. That's the trap, right?
Yeah.
That's the trap that you just described in the servicemen and women who, after suffering a cataclysmic injury, had challenge redefining what their purpose is because before that, their purpose was completely enmeshed in what they do as being
Right.
who they are, right?
Yes. Yes.
And when we can start to separate that, our world gets bigger. The possibility space gets bigger. Who and what we can be becomes this like expansive thing where I'm not just an artist, I'm not just a freestyle rapper, I'm not just a podcaster, I'm not just a coach, I'm not just a serial entrepreneur. Like those are things that I do. And because my purpose is bigger than all these things that I do, I can do a lot more. And I'm following the whatever is inspiring me, right? Because our curiosity and our desire are that is the GPS system to the signal within you that takes you where you need to go in order to create the life of your dreams.
Yeah. 100.
So that
Yes.
was a very roundabout way of just kind of sharing like how I orient towards purpose because I think it's a way of being. And I think that like your own unique artistic expression, it's meant to be something that is uniquely yours. And
Yes.
I think that building your identity fundamentally around not what you do, but who you are at a fundamental level is what creates the expansiveness and the capacity and the power to realize your wildest dreams.
100%. It helps you to realize your wildest dreams. And when you open it up in that sense of a way of being, it also invites so many more possibilities as you think about your life. I mean, your own reflection on your dad actually made me think, my dad, if you ask him what he did, like he would have said, well, he worked for the Department of Agriculture, right? Like my dad's dad passed away when my dad was six. He'd been in he'd actually been in the Navy, which is one of the reasons why I think my paternal grandfather had been. I'd never met him. He died when my dad was six. But I think my dad grew up always wanting to have a dad. And the thing that I think my dad really did, like his job was that he was a great dad to me and my two brothers. Like that was his purpose. That was his sense of self. I
Yeah.
think that, at the end of his life, he'd probably say this was one of his greatest achievements was what he did as a dad. And I think your insight into allowing people to have the opportunity to think of this as like, this is your way of being. It certainly doesn't have to be what you do for money. And it certainly doesn't have to um, you know, be defined by any narrow set of things that you're engaged in, but you actually you're brought here and you have the opportunity to live a really beautiful and purposeful life.
Yeah, and that's unique to each person. There is no value judgment of the scope and scale of one's purpose.
Right.
You know what I mean? Like
I think that's
my mom's purpose for most of her life was to be the best mom she could be.
yes.
And to this day, she often says that my sister and I, are her greatest achievement.
Yes. 100%.
And it's actually really beautiful. She's been going through a lot of personal transformations in her own life. And we did a leadership training and emotional intelligence workshop together. And she recently said she had a breakthrough moment where she said, I feel like up until this point, everything in my life has been about, you know, inspiring and raising and encouraging my kids to be the best they can be. And now they're doing it on their own. They don't need me anymore. And I was so lost in that because that was who I was and that was my identity. And she said that she had a really important breakthrough, which is that her life's not over and that she gets to create the next version of who she's becoming. And that the reason why other things in her life weren't working out is because, and her kids is because we were the only thing that she ever went all in on,
Yeah. Yeah.
all in, like
Yeah.
fully.
Yes.
And she's like, okay, you know what? I'm going to figure out what I'm going to go all in on next. And I'm going to go all in on me to start and see where that takes me. And I'm like, Mom, like,
Yeah.
so, so yeah, there is no right or wrong scope, you know. Some people like, yeah, there's no judgment of uh, whether someone's purpose is too big or too small. That's in the eye of the beholder, 100%. And I think you also nicely segue us into another essential component of purpose,
Yes.
which is service.
Yes. Yes.
Because, like, that's honestly, service is my religion,
Yes.
right?
Yes. Yes.
I have a very
I sense that
eclectic
for you. Yes.
worldview on spirituality and on the nature of the universe and on physics and how I see the world in a way that's dogmatically non-dogmatic and not something I'm trying to push or sell to anyone else, but that's uniquely mine. But ultimately, like when I say religion, the thing that I practice, that's part of who I am at a fundamental level that I show up to not just every Sunday, but every single moment of my life is asking myself again and again the question of how I can be of service to other people. And you, I feel like, Eric, you're such a good example of this in all the ways that you live your life, both by literally being in service to our country and in multiple different ways, not just in the military, right? Um, but I think that, you know, you you have reflected so many key aspects of what it means to be in service, how focusing out on other people helps you, you know, dissolve some of the suffering we create from our own mental anguish, right? And call it selfish, call it altruistic or not, doesn't really matter, right? I know from a pragmatic, realistic perspective that being of service to other people and what I create is what gives life some of the greatest richness and meaning and potency in living the best life that I can possibly live. And so I think we're social creatures. It's like fundamental to being human is to be of service to other people.
Yes.
So that's like, as forever whoever is listening, as you're on the journey of redefining and discovering the deeper layers of what your purpose is and what it means to you, just remember that creating value for other people is the only way that I have found that is in alignment with creating a meaningful purpose.
Yeah. And I think look at the example of what you were able to do for your mom. And I think there's some real beauty in that that I wanna touch on is that a lot of times when we think of service, people think exclusively about volunteering or going out and volunteering in the community, and that's a fantastic thing to do. Or they think about somebody who's in the military, or they think about somebody who's a teacher, and that those are absolutely beautiful ways to be of service. And what you were able to do for your mom is life changing. And if there's an insight right now that somebody's picking up in this podcast, that they're going to turn around and it's going to help them to be a little bit kinder, a little bit more purposeful, or a little bit more thoughtful later today or later this week after they've heard the podcast, that's tremendous service. And the one of the key lessons I want to point to underneath this is that both of those things have happened because you are courageously pursuing your purpose. And that we can often be of greatest service when we figure out the gifts that we have and figure out how to give them. And so rather than thinking of service as something that is external to ourselves, it's something that we go out into the world and we're going to go and do service, right? And
Mhm.
sometimes you do. Sometimes you go out into the world and you pick up the hammer and you work at Habitat for Humanity and you do the thing. But there's also a tremendous service that comes when we really find our gifts and we give them to the world.
Yes.
And God will find a way. If you're giving your gifts to the world, God will find a way for those gifts to make an influence in the lives of other people.
Yeah, 100%. And you nailed it. And being of service and service as a way of being is a default orientation to how you interface with yourself and with the world, right? I ask every single barista that I'm getting coffee from, no matter how much of a rush I'm in, how are you?
Yeah.
And like look them in the eye and really mean that. And
Yes.
there's not a really long line behind me,
Right.
and they
Right.
respond. And yeah, I've had I've been able to like spot coach people just from that,
Yes.
just from
Yes.
and I say spot coaching, maybe that's the wrong way to put it. Just offering a moment of reflection and
Offer a
appreciation and
kindness. You offer
love
some
and a
respect.
kindness
Yes.
to everyone, right? Because love isn't a limited resource.
Right.
It doesn't take anything away from you to give it. In fact, it's the opposite. It only gives you more the more you give it.
Yes.
So not only is it a renewable resource, it's an exponentially compounding resource.
Yes. And one of the great
And yeah, go ahead.
one of the great to build on that, one of the great visualizations, I think the Stoics use this, and maybe uh Buddha did too, but it's around love. Is it if I have a torch that's on fire and I use it to light your torch, it doesn't make mine any less bright.
Right.
And that kind of sharing that love and sharing that service can actually really help to light the world.
Love isn't a zero sum game.
Right.
It's an infinite game. And so now that it has been 10 years since you wrote this book, which
Yes.
timeless, I felt like I was talking to you. I felt like you were talking to me
Right.
just as we are now.
Yes.
I'm curious, what are some of the biggest insights, or maybe a better way to say this is like, what are some of the things you've learned in the last 10 years that if you were to do it all over again and rewrite the book or write a second
Sure.
version, what would you include now?
So it's interesting. It's a great question, and it's actually something I have done, which is that I've written another book, which hopefully
There's more?
yes will come out later this year, and it's tentatively titled The Ultimate Rebellion Handbook. And the idea behind the Ultimate Rebellion Handbook is that it's a book about how a man can take back his soul from a culture that's trying to take it away. And one of the things that was really striking in writing this book was I look back at resilience, which I literally have on my shelf right over there, and the world has changed a lot in the last decade.
Yep.
And the way that people consume information has also changed tremendously. And the challenges for a man to really find his way through to building an authentic and purposeful life, I think have been magnified. And there's some strong statistical evidence around this as well. Like you just look at the number of men who say that they have quality friendships in their life and the number of friends that they have in their life. It's been decreasing rapidly. And a lot of young men today don't have quality friendships. And especially once men get outside of the kind of high school and college years, you often see a very rapid decline in the number of friends who they have. So, so
Well,
there's just I think in the Ultimate Rebellion Handbook, I talk about some more of these issues around how you create friends. I also think, frankly, it's if you think of like all of the poison food and poison water that's in the environment, you think of what big pharma does to people. You think about the whole culture of trying to get everybody on drugs. You think about the whole sick care system, which is designed to make people ill. You think about the food system, which is designed to make people ill. I think that there are a lot of challenges for men in finding a way to live a kind of full and vibrant life. And so the Ultimate Rebellion Handbook is kind of this next set of lessons. I think that for me, in terms of my own kind of personal journey, I've written 4 books now, and each one is The Warrior's Heart was kind of a kid's adaptation for The Heart and the Fist, but each major book has come as a kind of one chapter has closed, And it's sort of been the end for my little hero's journey of like, here's the gift that has come from this. And now, having wrapped up this chapter for me with resilience, of having gone through the SEAL team training, done the deployments overseas, dealt with everything I dealt with overseas, starting the mission continues, resilience was kind of that gift to the world. The Ultimate Rebellion Handbook is kind of a reflection, I hope, of gifts that have come from this most recent chapter. And so I don't know that there's anything that I would go back and change. I think one of the things that I said very specifically in resilience was that what I said I'm not an expert in, and I won't be talking as much about in resilience, is the power of love. And I think that over the course of, say, the last 8 years or so, my own relationship with my boys, my relationship with my girlfriend, my relationship with a tremendous set of wonderful friends who've kind of either seen me through hardship or come into my life in a beautiful way, has really opened a whole new way of also understanding myself. And so there's that's one of the places where I think the resilience book, no book is ever complete, right? Like every book, there's no book with every answer in it. But for me, that's certainly been a horizon of growth over the course of the last 8 years or so. And I've really been so grateful to so many fantastic friends, and the opportunity to, raise my beautiful sons who teach me about life every day. And they get, one of the beautiful things about being a parent is you get to discover everything again. And if you choose to, like, you get to play and you get to discover everything again, and you get to see everything anew. And you can do just tremendous, fantastic adventures that you'll go on with your kids. And so they've been a real joy for me in this last chapter as well.
Amazing. Well, Eric, this has been a luscious, vibrant, inspiring conversation. Thank you so much for taking the time to speak with me today. I've very much enjoyed the conversation. It sounds like there's a lot more for us to cover, so we might have to do this again. I mean, we didn't even cover your story arc of being the governor of Missouri, which I'm sure could be a whole other
Yes.
series of episodes. And there's so much more to share. So I'm really looking forward to the next time that we get to speak together.
Also, I would be honored to be on with you again. Really enjoyed this. Really proud of what you're doing, and proud to be a part of it.